So let's now finish building the pagination feature. And for that, let's actually think about some different scenarios. And to do that, I will actually come here to the demo. So the buttons that we want to render down here are not always the same. So in this first scenario, we are on page 1. And so therefore, only this next button here is showing, right? But there is, of course, no button to go back. Now, if we had actually less than 10 results, so basically only one search page, then there would be no buttons at all. Then, if we are on some other page, which is not the first page, well, then we have a button to go back and one to go forward. So that is basically the third scenario. And then if we go all the way to the last page, then we only have a button to go back. And so we have to account for all of these different scenarios. Okay, so let's go back and basically implement a new view for this pagination. So here in the views, we create a new file called paginationview.js. And here let's actually copy some code from here so we don't have the same work over and over again. Then of course this one here is called pagination view, and the parent element is not this one. So let's go check out our markup. And so here we already are at the right element. So you see that after this unordered list of results, we have this div element with the class of pagination. And so then this one here already contains the template for a button to go back, so to the previous page, and one button to go to the next page. So we're going to need this soon, but for now let's just complete this setup here. Okay. And so now, just as all the other classes, we will have a generate markup method here. Generate markup. Because remember, that is the method that the render method is going to call in order to generate the markup for the view that we're working on. Right? So again, every view, at least every view that renders something to the user interface, needs a generate markup method. So that's this one here. And so now let's account for these different scenarios that we just saw. So let's say the first one is we are at page 1 and there are other pages. Then the next one is we are on page 1 and there are no other pages. Then there is the scenario that we are on the last page, and also the scenario that we are on some other page, basically. So other page like this. Okay, so what data do we need in order to figure out if we are on page 1 and if there are other pages? Well, for that we are going to need basically this entire search object here. So this contains all the search results, also the current page and the results per page. And so we will need all of this data in order to compute which buttons should be displayed. All right. And so let's actually go to our controller and already call the render function so that we can pass in the data that we need and so that we can then use it. And well, when do we actually want to display the pagination? Well, it is actually right at the moment when we are also displaying the search results. So we will actually do that right here after displaying the results. So we get the search query, load the search results, render the results, and then also render the initial pagination buttons. And so now here we actually need to export this view so that we can then import it into the controller. So just like we have been doing in all the other views, we say export default and then a new pagination view object. And so then we come here and import that. So results becomes pagination. And now, of course, that view has a render method on it. So pagination view dot render. And here we need to pass in basically the entire search object. So state dot search. And actually that's model dot state dot search. And so now through the magic of this view class here, we now get access to this data that we just passed in this dot underscore data. Right? So right here, this dot underscore data is now the entire search results object, basically. So in order to figure out if we are on page 1 and there are other pages, we need to know how many pages there are. So let's compute that. So const num pages. And how do we actually know the number of pages? Well, basically we need the number of results divided by the number of results per page, right? So for example, if we had 60 results and 10 results per page, then we had 6 pages. So the number of results comes from this dot data dot results. So let's check that in the model here again. So results, again, is the entire array which contains all the search results. And then we also have results per page, which is this configuration constant that we set to 10. Remember? So let me copy this. And then here we will divide that. So this dot data dot results per page. And this is a very important variable. So let's start by logging it to the console. And with this, we will then also know if we correctly hooked everything up here. So basically, if this render here of the pagination view is already doing its work. So let's see. Searching for pizza. Well, here we get some, not a number. And of course, well, here actually we already have something rendered. And so that's undefined because right now we are not returning anything from this function. And so if we don't return anything, by default, undefined is returned. And so that's 10 basically rendered here to the page. But anyway, what matters here is that for some reason we got not a number. So that means, and I know why here. So here, this is the entire array, right? So we are dividing this array by the number. But of course, what we want is the length of the array. So let's try that again. Yeah, now we get 5.9 pages. And of course, we now need to round that to the next highest integer. And so for that, we simply use math.ceil, remember? And so this will now become 6. Okay, so let's do some check here. So if we're currently on page 1, which is this dot data dot page equals 1. And so now it is very important that we actually have the current page in the state, right? So that's why we put it right here. So whenever the get search results page method is being called with some value. So just to illustrate this, let's actually render the results at page 2. Just to then test if what we have here works. But anyway, here we are testing if we're on page 1. And so that's this.data.page equals 1, and there are other pages. And so basically that means that the current page needs to be less than the number of pages. And so that basically means that number of pages here is greater than 1. So num pages greater than 1. So this is our first if check. Let's actually log that to the console. Page 1 and others. Or actually, let's even return that string, because we already know that this will then get printed. Even though, of course, this is not at all what we want. Now this one here we will leave to the end. So let's continue with this one. So being on the last page basically means that the current page is the same as the number of pages, right? So data.page is equal the number of pages. So in the current example, we have 6 pages. And so if the current page is number 6, well, then that means we are on the last page. So here let's return last page. Then here some other page basically simply means that the current page is less than the number of pages. And if any of what I'm saying doesn't make sense, then probably the best thing to do is to pause the video and think about this on your own. So that's always my advice. So basically reflecting on what I'm saying is usually the best solution to really figuring out what exactly it is what I'm doing here. So of course I'm trying my best to explain everything, but at a certain point you also have to take a look at the code and think about it on your own a bit. But anyway, this actually already covers all of the scenarios. So if none of these scenarios here is met, then that basically means that we are on page 1 and there are no other pages. And so in this case, we can return only one page. And actually that is not really true, because let's say that we only had 1, so that num page would be 1, then actually this here would also be true. So here we have to add the same as before. So num pages needs to be also greater than 1. So then we are really on the last page and need to render some other buttons. So, but to test this, let's keep in mind that we are currently on page 2. And so therefore we want to now see other page rendered. So let's see. And indeed, there we have other page. Now let's try page number 6. So here we see we have 6 pages. And so now it says last page. Great. And now page number 1. And so one more time. And so page 1, but there are other pages. Great. So this was, I think, the hardest part. So figuring out these different scenarios. And now all we need to do is to create the markup. So let's come here to the HTML and grab this code. So this is the code for going to the previous page. So when do we want to go to the previous page? Well, for example, right here on the last page, right? So here, in fact, we only want exactly that one button. Now, what is the page here that we want to go to? So we need this number here. Well, that page is basically the current one minus 1. Right? So we are using this data.page a lot of times. So let's store that in a variable. So yeah, const current page is this. And so now let's replace that everywhere here with current page. So here we will then want the current page minus 1. And here we need to replace the icons. Okay. Then here on page 1, we basically need the opposite. So again, we only want just one button, but the one to go to the next page. So let's grab it. And actually, it's almost the same markup. So another nice template literal. And now here it says page 3. And so, of course, here we will now want to go to the current page plus 1. Right? And then here again, we need to replace the icons. Okay. And then here for the other page, we want basically both of them. So let's return this, or actually this one here. So first the button to go back. And then also add the button to go forward. All right. And then when we're on page 1, then we simply return nothing, because here we don't want to render any button. So if there are no other pages, there's nowhere to go, of course. All right. So let's see what page we are currently on. So page 1. And so that should render. And so that should render then this button here. So saying page 2. So let's see. And indeed, page 2. Now, of course, if we click here, then nothing is going to happen. But for now, that is not the point. Let's try page number 4 now. So go back to page 3 or forward to page 5. So beautiful. So it looks like it's working. Let's just try the last page here now. Oh, what's going on here? And indeed, it says to go back to page 5, but no page to go forward. So that's awesome. Now the next thing that we need to do here is to then add an event listener to these buttons so that we can then actually go back and display another page. So right now, this is not useful at all, but at least we already have our buttons here showing up right in the beginning when the search results are loaded. Okay. Now, this code here could, of course, be refactored because we are repeating a lot of code here. So this button is the same as this next button, and the previous button is also the same here. Okay, so we could refactor that, but I will actually not do it here and instead leave it for you as a challenge. So you might create a method called, for example, generate markup button, and then refactor that code in that method. But here, I'm not going to waste any more time, and instead I will go immediately to adding the event listener. Now, just like before, we need to use the publisher subscriber pattern, just like we did, for example, here in the recipe view. Remember? So again, that works by creating a publisher, which is basically a function which is the one listening for the event, which receives a handler function, which in our case is going to be a controller that lives here in the controller. And so with this, we will then be able to listen for the event here in the view where it makes sense, while at the same time being able to handle that event from the controller, basically. Okay? So let's add that method here. So add handler, and I'm just calling it click. So for click on one of the buttons. Okay? Now here we are going to use event delegation because there are going to be two buttons, but of course we don't want to listen to each of them individually. So instead we will add the event listener to the a common parent element, which is indeed this dot parent element. So dot add event listener, and this time finally listening for a click. And then here we have a function, because we cannot immediately call the handler that comes in here, because first we will need to figure out which button was actually clicked based on the event. So that's event delegation, and I hope you remember how it works. So in this case, we can simply create a button element and select the closest button element to the clicked element. So the clicked element is e.target, and then closest, which is really an amazing method. And so here we can now basically look for this button. So for the element with this class. All right. So remember that the closest method is a little bit like query selector, but instead for searching down in the tree, so for children, it basically searches up in the tree. So it looks for parents. And this is important because here in the button, we might actually click on this span element or on this SVG or this use instead of clicking on the button itself. So we cannot simply set the button to e.target, but we actually need to search for the closest button element itself. And just to see that this works, let's actually now create our controller. So here we will then log that button to the console only for now. All right. And so now let's go to the controller, and as always, create a new controller here. So basically, this is the controller that will be executed whenever a click on one of the buttons happens. So control pagination is a function which for now doesn't really do anything. Let's just call it pag controller. So simply logging this to the console. But what matters here is that now we call the pagination view and add handler click. And so this will then, of course, call this function here, which in turn will call add event listener so that we can start listening for the click event on this pagination element. Okay. Now here we also pass in the handler. So that's control pagination. And so just again to check if everything is working, let's simply also call that handler right here. So once we click on the button now, we should see this button logged to the console, and then also the handler function should run, which is of course this one. And so that should then log pag controller. So let's see. So looks like we're still on the last page. Let's click, and yeah, so everything works as expected. We have the button correctly selected, and it also says pagination controller. Great. So now we have the click on the button, so it is correctly selected. But why did we actually select the button? Well, we need a way of knowing which is the page where we need to go now. So it says here page 5, but how will JavaScript know that it should now actually display the results of page number 5 here? Well, this is where we one more time need to basically establish a connection between the DOM and our code. And so remember that we can do that using the custom data attributes. So what we will do here is to create a data attribute on each of the buttons, which will contain the page that we want to go to. And so then in our code, we can read that data and make JavaScript or make our application go to that exact page. And so this is basically the final piece of the puzzle. Okay, so here in our button, let's now add that data attribute. So data, and I'm going to call it go to. And so the page we want to go to is exactly the same as this one. So basically exactly the same that it says in the button text itself. So now let's copy that everywhere. Here it is page number, so -1. Here again, -1. And then here on this, it is page +1, right? And so then here we can actually get that number, of course, from the button. So let's call it go to page, and it is button dot data set dot go to. And then let's log that to the console. All right. And actually, let's go to some other page. So basically start this here on page 4, just so we have 2 buttons. Very weird what's happening here with the scroll. But anyway, here we have now the buttons for page 3 and 5. So let's click. And indeed, here we have the 5, and we also successfully read the 5 here. Now you see that this is here like kind of in this white, while this here is purple. So remember that purple here means a number, and so this is still a string, and so we will need to convert that. But another thing that I wanted to show you is that, of course, we can also click outside of one of the buttons, right? And so then here the button is, of course, null, and we get an error by trying to read the data set. So let's first convert that value we get from the user interface, but all of this should only happen if there actually is a button. So yet another guard clause here saying if there is no button, then return immediately. Okay. So let's try another one now, pasta. And if we click now, then here we get the number 3 and here the number 5, right? So what are we going to do now with this number? Well, we can simply pass that number back to the controller, basically. And then in the controller, we can finally use that number to actually render the results on the page that we want by using, again, this method here. All right. So these pagination and results controllers are kind of intertwined. So I think that this is a little bit confusing because of that. But if you analyze all of this here, maybe afterwards, you'll see that it makes sense. So we already see that here in the controller, we are rendering the pagination in the beginning. And so here in the pagination, we will later render the new results. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. And so what I want to do now here is to actually pass that page into the handler. Okay. And so, of course, our handler now needs to accept this value. So let's call it again, go to page. And just to see again if this works, log that value to the console. Okay. And indeed, we get page number 5, which is the button that we clicked on, coming from the controller this time. And now, finally, what should actually happen here on the user interface once we click this button? Well, we should get the search results for page number 5, and they should be rendered here, right? And then also new buttons should be rendered too. So this should then change to page 4 and this to page 6. Because when we go forward, then these two values here are, of course, going to increase. Okay, and so let's simply do that. And we already know how to do it because we already did it before. So remember I said we want to render the results and we want to render the pagination buttons. And so that is exactly what we already have here. And so let's simply copy and paste it right here. So let me change this here to render new results. And then here, render new pagination buttons. And then here, of course, we want not number 4, but we want go to page. And then here, rendering the new pagination buttons is actually going to stay exactly the same, right? So when we do this here, so get search results with this new page, let's say 4, then here in the model, state.search.page gets updated to that new value, right? So the state.search object is then different, and so that is the object that we then pass into rendering the new pagination. And so therefore, it will then render new buttons because the page before has been changed. Okay, and so this should now actually work. Just keep in mind that we will again start at page number 4. Well, let's actually make that page 3. Oh, and before actually checking out the results, I just wanted to say that this actually works because renderer will basically overwrite the markup that was there previously. And the reason for that is that we here have the clear method. And so before any new HTML is inserted into the page, the parent element is first cleared. So it's first emptied, right? And so then that means that render here basically overwrites everything that was there and puts the new content in the same place. But anyway, let's make sure to reload pizza, and we are at page number 3. And now let's see the magic happen. And I hope we don't have any bug here. And it works. So beautiful, beautiful. And congratulations also for you to following up until this point. So this is, I think, up until this point, the most impressive work that we have done. So you see, everything updates here just as expected. We get new content. And now page 6, you see here, will be the last page. So let's see. And yeah, so now we don't have the last button and we can only go back to page 5. So now let's go to the first page. And indeed, we can only now move forward and get the first 10 results here. So really great work here. I'm really happy about this progress here. Now, just to make sure, one more thing, let's try this here with results per page of a different value. So let's say that we actually wanted like only 5 results per page. So then we should get a lot more pages. And so it's important that we check that that actually works. So you see that it does actually work already. So we only have 5 results here now. And we can also already see that we will have 12 pages. Oh, and we are still on page number 3. But now we will be able to go back, or actually to go forward to page number 12. And so each of these pages only has 5 recipes. And now let's just try to search for something that is not very common, like dip, for example. And, well, we still have a couple of pages here, actually. But before we go any further, let's put this here actually to 0, or actually to 1. And remember that passing nothing is basically the same as setting it to 1. So let's try dip here again. But it seems like we have still 6 pages. So I just wanted to find some search term that only has 1 page. Let's try hummus maybe. But we again have 4 pages. Well, we can fake that by having 50 results on one page. And so with this, we should already only have one page with pasta. So pasta has 45 results, but here we want 50 on one page. So we only have one page, you see, and indeed, no buttons. Great. Let's put it back to a meaningful value, so 10. And so with this, we are actually done. Let's just clean up our code here a little bit more. But I think that with this, we are now good to call this finished. And actually, we finished now the entire part 1 of our flowchart. Right? So this was already done this here as well. And now, here what we did was to listen to this event, then render the pagination buttons, and of course, render the corresponding search results. So all of this is now in place, but I ask you to really analyze again the code that we have here in control pagination, as well as here in control search results. Because again, these two controllers, they're kind of intertwined. So they both are doing similar things, at least when it comes to displaying the pagination and the results themselves. So it's very important that you understand the flow of this data here, especially of this go to page. Okay, and then maybe also analyze again how all of this here works, but then you are good to go to the next video. And so there we will discuss basically our next step, what we should do next. So that next video is going to be a lot shorter so that we can finally take a break from this application. So again, analyze this like I told you to, and then after you're ready, let's go move on to our next part of the flowchart.